Hi, I'm Lacey Bankhead with Cultivate Biblical Studies, and this week we're going over week 7 from Exodus part 1. Last week when we met in person, when we did week 7, we had a guest speaker, David Parrish from Magnolia Baptist Church in Cleveland, that came in and did like a mock faux Passover for us. It was incredible, and I've linked it down here. It's part of my YouTube series here, so you can go and watch it. What was so incredible about it is Pastor David brought everything from the Old Testament, from what we were studying in Exodus, and correlated with the Last Supper in John. So he brought the Old Testament and the New Testament together to collide for Passover. It's absolutely phenomenal. I did the best I could videoing it for Pastor David having to move all over the room and a lot of stuff going on, but I hope that you enjoy that and watch that. You're going to learn a lot from that. And if you need any of the slideshow presentation because you'd like to teach the Passover class, or you'd like to do it with your family, or just have more extensive notes on it, get with me and I will be happy to send that to you. So I'm just going to briefly go over Exodus 11 and 12 because it was gone over so much in the Passover video. So let's get started. If you want to pause the video here, this is a good time for you to read Exodus 11 and 12. You out loud if you can, or if you can listen to it while you read it. Any of those are really great options for getting that information. So pause right here, listen or read Exodus 11 and 12, and I'll meet you back here in a second. Okay, so the first 10 verses of these two chapters, and that means the entirety of chapter 11 in Exodus, is called a pericope. A pericope, and that is a literary term, and it means it's an extracted passage from the Bible. So this is kind of like a pause in time to give us some information, and then the story continues. So when you read that, if Exodus 11 feels like it doesn't really fit in, it's almost like a review period of what's been going on so far. It's a little pericope, a little extracted passage that's inside Exodus. So the announcement of the 10th plague, which is going to have the death of the firstborn plus also Passover, it's carefully sandwiched between two reminders of what previously had been revealed. So the first reminder, the 10th plague, would be effective at producing the Exodus. That's verses 1 through 3. This final plague will be effective at producing the final result that we've been waiting for, the Exodus, and that the Israelites would attain wealth for their journey from Egypt into the wilderness. Do you remember what that war term was called, that battle term? It's the word plunder, that they're going to leave there with great possession, a lot of plunder. And the second reminder, which is verses 9 and 10, so in this pericope, the first 3 verses are the first reminder, and the last 2 verses are the second reminder that the entire series of prior plagues had not resulted in the Exodus, because that's not the way that Yahweh had planned things. Remember when we reviewed from the beginning, back on pages 22 and 25 of this workbook, you can look at some of those past verses and see that God says the Exodus isn't going to come until firstborn of Egypt dies. So because that hasn't happened yet, the Exodus and the exit from Egypt in turn cannot happen either. So the reminders at the beginning and end of this chapter, it's new narrative material for a reason. It has the effect of helping orient the reader, reminding you that the death of the firstborn isn't a standalone event. This is part of the plagues. This is part of what's been the prophetic word of Yahweh since the beginning of this book. It's a culminating act of a long process controlled by God. All of it has unfolded just as God predicted way back in chapter 3. So I don't want you to think of this last plague as a standalone thing, even though it's kind of standing alone in Scripture, but it's a culminating of all these events that have happened up until now. Because what is the main and central theme of Exodus? Yep, the God who makes himself known. So what is Moses' point in writing Exodus this way? He's unfolding it as it's happening, with the main and central theme in mind the whole time, that this is God's prophetic word about what was going to happen, this is how it's happening, and this is how it's going to unfold. So On page 70, if you'd flip over there with me, and then also have a page on 61 because we're going to come back. This is your one and only fill-in for this week. Moses was writing this story not merely to help his fellow Israelites trust Yahweh as things happened, but to help them learn to trust Yahweh is the one who makes things happen in the first place. And it's all part of his great redemptive plan for the benefit of his people. So I'm going to repeat that. And it's the only thing that I've got in here because we're going to talk about Passover, and we're going to talk about the death of the firstborn. And you might have taken a lot of Passover notes already on page 70 if you went to the live class. If not, while you're watching Pastor David, feel free to leave some notes here. Some people took up 2 and 3 pages of notes because there were just such interesting information. But I just wanted this main point to be in here in your notes because it really helps you keep your mind focused and directed about what's going on. So again, Moses was writing this story not merely to help his fellow Israelites trust Yahweh as things happened. So let's pause there. Trusting Yahweh as things happen, because at this point they know who Yahweh is, but they're still having revealed to them the full story. So they're trusting Yahweh as things happen, but no, this is to help them trust Yahweh who makes things happen. And that's what I want you to remember in these 2 chapters. God, Yahweh, is making these things happen in accordance with his will, in accordance with the word that he already spoke in chapter 3. He is making events turn this specific way. So it's part of his great redemptive plan for the benefit of his people. So when we get into this and we think the firstborn die in every household, that means the only person that would be left in my household would be my husband. Laurel and I would be gone. I mean, it would affect every single household. This is a really big deal. So sometimes we think, why would God allow this to happen? Why would he make this happen? Why would he send the destroyer to make these things happen? But it is the benefit of his people. Sometimes God is such a mystery, and that's part of his attributes that are so unsettling to us because we don't understand them, because we can't be omniscient, we can't be omnipresent, we're not transcendent or immanent, so we cannot understand the mystery of the God's infinitude, just being part of infinity and so many things that we can't understand. And I want you to keep that in mind, that he makes these things happen for the benefit of us and to the glory of his name. So God had just demonstrated his power now over the people, over the gods, over the land, the animals, the water, nature, light and darkness, all of the plagues that have happened until now. He is about to show the ultimate demonstration of his sovereignty. Pharaoh's not going to just let them go. He's going to drive them out. Look at verse 1 on page 61. The Lord said to Moses, "Yet one more plague I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you away completely." Those are strong words. Not only all this time, Pharaoh is like, "Oh, I'm not going to let you go, not like going to let you go," and then wanting to negotiate on letting them go. But this time, not only does he let them go, but he makes them leave. He drives them out of the land. So look at verse 2 and 3 on page 61. There's a new point that's being brought up. Egypt and Pharaoh are not on the same page. Go back and look at Exodus 8:19, Exodus 9:20, and Exodus 10:7. So we've been getting little clues in those verses that the Egyptians have been distancing themselves from their tyrant king, the Pharaoh, little by little. Now look at verse 3. And it looks like the Egyptians are on Team Moses, because it says, "And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. He gave the Israelites favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the Israelites." So the Israelites, the Egyptians, and even Pharaoh's servants, like living in the palace, living and serving Pharaoh, are now turning their heads towards Moses and, in effect, towards Yahweh. So that's something that's new that we're really seeing happen. And we got clues in chapters 8, 9, and 10, but now we're actually seeing it happen. And why do you think this is? I think that, God made Pharaoh's hard heart remain for the purpose of his glory, but also at the same time didn't harden the hearts of the Egyptians so their hearts can be softened. And I think what they're seeing, the reality of what they're seeing when they stand back and look at it, is resistance against Yahweh is absolutely useless. It's futile. There's no standing against him, and they're watching their king stand against him and thinking, I think we might be on the wrong side. And this is why we're going to see later in the Exodus, there are Egyptians that turn from their Egyptian gods, turn to Yahweh, and are going to leave into the wilderness with the Israelites. So in review, why did God blind Pharaoh from reason and harden his heart? Well, it was a punishment for his own oppression that he had laid out for the Israelites. But also God needs to demonstrate his divine power. So he needs Pharaoh to remain stubborn right now, because in the end, Pharaoh's stubbornness is going to turn into his own demise with pushing people out of Egypt. So, do you think the Egyptians willingly provide financial means to Moses and the Israelites because they really like them, or is there supernatural influence? So what do you think there about verses 2 and 3, where it's going to say, ask your neighbor and every woman of her neighbor for silver and gold jewelry, and the people found favor. So the Egyptians start to lavish onto the Israelites their riches. This is part of the plunder. Is this happening because they just really like Moses and the Israelites, or because they're afraid of Yahweh, or do you think it's supernatural influence that allows favor and blessing so abundantly on the Israelites? So look at verse 4, where it says, thus says the Lord, thus says Yahweh, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Did you notice in verse 4 that God personally says he will personally move through Egypt to bring about the death of the firstborn? Because I want you to think about this. This has to do with the destroyer word that you looked at in your homework. Thus says the Lord, I will go out into the midst of Egypt. He's talking about personally moving through the land. So think about this. In the prior plagues, God causes the plagues. Now Yahweh himself is the immediate performer of the plague. Yes, he was performing the plagues before, but it could have just been his breath, his thoughts, his hand, his divine power through the staff. But this time Yahweh is going to move through the city streets. The actual visitor of the homes of the Egyptians is going to be Yahweh. Of course, in 1223, we are going to see the enigmatic reference to the word destroyer, which we're going to talk about. But before we get to that, why do you think God announced the deaths would occur at midnight? I don't think it has anything to do with a time or a new day beginning. But remember the plague of darkness, the very last plague. That was the darkest, deepest part of night, that we talked about. That was the most unsettling part of night, when there was literally no light, no day. So, also, what are people doing during that time? They're asleep. Because they cannot work during night hours like we can now. We have a lot of people that work night shifts doing things. At this point, everyone was asleep at night, and they worked during the day in the light. Do you think that God chose midnight because it was the greatest time for vulnerability and defenselessness of these people? Or do you think he did it because he has mercy and they were asleep? But even if this was the greatest time for vulnerability and the greatest time for their defenselessness, being in the middle of the night when everyone's asleep, isn't that just God's grace and mercy? Allowing people to die in their sleep as an act of grace, instead of striking them down in the field, or, doing it in a dangerous time. Maybe they're on a horse, or moving through the city themselves, but actually just letting them remain sleeping forever. Just want you to think about that. So the three questions that naturally arise in connection were in verse 5. Was God fair to kill the firstborn of families all over Egypt when by this time it was Pharaoh resisting God and not the people? That's the first question. I'm going to ask that again. Because these are questions that naturally arise that I've heard people ask, that I thought of myself when I'm reading this. Was God, Yahweh, fair? Was he being fair to kill the firstborn of families all over Egypt when by this time it was Pharaoh resisting God and not the people? Like, why do the Egyptians have to suffer if it's just Pharaoh that's being disobedient? Second question, why do the firstborn of cattle need to die? I mean, God's already plagued the livestock and killed a bunch of them off. Now even more of them are going to need to die. Okay, third question, would families with only girls escape the devastation of this plague, since the translation says firstborn son? And we are going to talk about that. So before I do, I want you to skip to verse 6 and read. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been nor ever will be again. I want you to think about the wailing that is predicted here in verse 6. It wasn't the pain of dying. It is the wailing grief in the morning when all the dead were discovered in virtually every single Egyptian household. That's what I want you to think about when we answer these questions. I want you to think of the magnitude of grief and suffering for the Egyptian people as we answer these questions. So to answer the first question, was God fair to kill families of Egypt, even though Pharaoh was only the one that was being in the wrong at this time? So the answer to that question is impossible to state briefly or very simply. Because, like I just said, wouldn't that involve understanding every single part of the nature of God? And that is absolutely impossible, because you would have to understand every single intricacy of God's attributes of wrath and justice. That's such a mystery, because we can't see from Genesis at creation and then also the end when the rapture and the tribulation and the apocalypse happen. We can't see all of that at once. We only see one or two puzzle pieces for our lifetime. So because we can't see all of that, we can never understand fully any of the attributes of God, and we can't understand his wrath or justice, because we can't stand at the beginning and we can't stand at the end like he does right now and see it all as one complete piece. So God does so many things that are way beyond our human understanding. Because our God has a higher intellect than us, our intellect is very limited. We cannot appreciate or understand the vast complexity of God or his eternal plan. This is the time where you have to trust in faith about what God is doing for the glory of him, his divine nature, and for the good of his people over all time. So God's plan wasn't just an act of rebellion against Pharaoh. It was a definitive display of his superiority and sovereignty. For him to make this choice that the firstborn were going to die in all of these hundreds of thousands of households, we have to believe that he is superior and sovereign. Because if we don't, we can never make any sense of why he does this. We have to be able to admit that we do not have the intellectual capacities or understanding about him enough to say, I understand exactly why he did this. I hope that makes sense to you. So is the idea of innocent people dying just unique to this plague? No, people died in other plagues too. Remember the hail coming down? People die all the time of natural causes and disasters. This shouldn't be surprising that God chooses death. We know that the plagues have been getting worse and worse and worse. So one of the questions that was asked to me by text is, why did the firstborn of cattle need to die? Well, let's answer that cattle question for you. But let's ask a few more questions to answer that question. When were cattle created? Do you remember? In creation? Okay, that's your first thing to think about. Is there a symbolic relationship between cattle and humans? Would a full humiliation of Pharaoh and Egypt naturally include the death of the firstborn cattle? answering these other questions. So to answer that question, I want you to go back and I want you to look at creation, because I want you to intellectually think about this. I want you to independently think about this. I want you to go back to the creation account, look at when cattle were created. Is there a symbiotic, symbolic relationship between cattle and humans? And then, to answer, would a full humiliation of Pharaoh in Egypt naturally include the death of firstborn cattle? So go back into Genesis. That's going to be in Genesis 2. Also might look at a little bit of Genesis 3. Check that out, answer that question. So then let's look at the last question. Would families with only girls escape the devastation of this plague, since the translation, just this translation, not the Hebrew, but this specific translation says firstborn son? So go forward and look at 1230. And that is on your page 65. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. The phrase firstborn is the Hebrew word bakor. And I'm writing that up here because I think I'm spelling it, or I know I'm spelling it correctly. Am I saying it correctly? Bakor, meaning firstborn of men and women. That phrase, firstborn. Every time you see it in here, look at verse 29 on page 65. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the bakor, all the firstborn of men and women in the land of Egypt. From the bakor, the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the bakor, the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and the bakor of all the livestock. So this does not define sons and daughters. This is all men and women, the firstborn of both sexes. From the highest class to the lowest class of them, and to the mere cattle, all the firstborn died. So let's look at that word, great cry and wailing, back on verse 6 on page 61. That great cry, circle that word cry. This is the Hebrew word sa'aka. Check out Exodus 3, 7, and 9, back on page 21. So flip back with me to page 21. And we're looking at verses 7 or 9. And you're going to circle the word cry again, because this is the same word. I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry, circle that, because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land to a good broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry, circle that cry, of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. That word cry. This was, think back, the Israelites crying out. The Sa'aka, they were crying out because of the oppression, because they were dying under the hand of the taskmasters. And now it's the Egyptians. It was the Israelites, and now it's the Egyptians with the same exact kind of cry. The same word used to describe the Israelites' outcry. Now the tables have turned, and it's Egypt's turn to wail for an even greater suffering. Verse 6 says this would be the greatest wailing ever in the history of Egypt. Can you think of a parallel grief that would compare to this magnitude and sudden loss of life? Well, this is going to happen again in the time of Herod when Jesus is born. There's going to be an edict to go out to kill sons again. And then think about the Holocaust, the mass suffering. Think about any of the world wars and bombings. Think about Syria. Think about the sarin gas in Syria killing thousands of people and making them extremely sick to the point of death, and heart disease and heart defects and all that stuff. This is not the only time in history that there has been an outcry and a crying and grief that has been up to this magnitude. To this magnitude, yes, at this time in history for Egypt, but this is not going to be the last time this happens in the history of the earth. So look at verse 7. It again shows there would be simply no harm whatsoever from the 10th plague to the Israelites. Look at it, says, but not a dog shall even growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. You guys, he makes a distinction between you and an unbeliever. That is not just for this time. This is now. There is a distinction. You have that mark of the cross on your life, that God can make a distinction between you and someone else. And here again, the Israelites would be untouched. Look at verse 8. Moses is predicting another role reversal. This time, the people that had bowed to Pharaoh would now bow to Moses. Not because Moses was sovereign, but because he represented who Yahweh was. Look at verse 8. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, get out, you and all the people who follow, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. So I don't want you to think that the lengthy descriptions of preparing Passover and the instructions here starting in in chapter 12, are interfering with the flow of the narrative. It's not that at all. Everyone is waiting for the big climax, the big 10th plague moment. But in the interim of waiting for that, in chapter 12, we have to do a Passover. God is going to give lengthy descriptive instructions about exactly how Passover needs to be carried out. And without watching the Passover video or have taken that class last week on Wednesday, it's not going to make a lot of sense to you. Once you watch that video or you understand more about Passover, it makes sense why this needed to be so descriptive and why Passover needed to be a ritual and a rite that had very specific, exacting steps. So I think Moses put this right here for the best interest of the original audience. And why do you think that is? Well, they were on the cusp of the promised land. They would think about the original audience. They're about to go into the promised land. They would need to follow these instructions really well after a long hiatus of not having any practice with them at all. But moreover, once these Israelites right now leave Egypt, cross the Red Sea, get the 10 Commandments, this is really when we will understand why the Passover meal is talked about in 3 different ways in these chapters. So we're not going to really understand that until we get into part 2. The theme of God saving his people for worship and holiness is just beginning here. We are saved to be sanctified. Throughout most of the rest of Exodus, we will see the theme over and over. Saved to be sanctified. Saved to be sanctified. And we're going to see that in the Passover. Things had to be done in such a way. You had to have clean hands. You had to not break bones. All of these things had to happen in a specific way because this is just the beginning of the theme, saved to be sanctified. So the precise description of the 10th plague reveals that it would take place in a handful of hours. Like this is coming down, the dominoes are falling very quickly. This would be a hands-on strike of divine power against Egypt and its gods. So, did the actual blood that they had to paint on their doorposts and the lintel actually deter death? No. You can go ahead and paint blood all over your house right now. It's not going to deter death from coming to your home. It was the blood that was a testimony of faith in Yahweh. It was walking out there in faith, painting that above your door in faith that God and the destroyer would pass by your house, pass over you, and go on to the next house. It all had to do with faith. And that was just the symbolic action. Going out there and painting that on your door was just a symbolic action of the faith that you had in trust of Yahweh. So see in verse 13, it says, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So when God says this, when I see the blood, I'll pass over you, this is like God saying, I'm going to spare all those who show that they have placed their fear and their faith in me. What do you notice in verse 16 about the first and the last day of the feast? Look at verse 16. What's going to happen on the first and last day? A sacred holy assembly. Days devoted to worship. Assembly is the Hebrew word mikra, meaning calling together. Getting all of the Israelites together in this way is also the same in the Levitical description of the Sabbath, the Day of Trumpets, and the New Moon Festival. Needs a sacred holy assembly, calling together all of the believers. So look at verse 17. What does the last sentence say? Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. Forever does not end with us. Forever is still going on right now in our day. How important is this day of remembrance? Should Passover be incorporated into your life? You know, it happens just a couple of weeks before Easter every year. I think it'd probably be a pretty simple thing to put together, like a small Passover in the way that we did with Pastor David, and celebrate this in your families. This is a really important way to remember what happened in the Old Testament with God's divine power, but also to connect it to Jesus in the Last Supper, in the final hours before his crucifixion. So I think it's an important thing that it should be we should have reverence for, and that we should start doing in remembrance in our own homes. So I want you to consider that. I'm going to put some links below on a couple of books that you can buy from Amazon if you would like to start implementing this in your own household once a year before Easter. So just some food for thought there on what this would mean to our children and what this would mean to our families if we started incorporating this into our lives as a holiday for us as Christians. So in verse 21, this is now on page 64, Moses instructs the leaders in the Israelite community to start getting these things done. The time is drawing near when God is going to pass through. Israel needs to be ready to go. Look at verse 21. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, go and select lambs, just the elders, for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Like, start getting this together. Let's start going. Now we finally get to the word destroyer, verse 23, the enigmatic word, and it begs a lot of questions. Why did God himself need to go through the land? Did God need to get close up to see the blood on the doors? And who is the destroyer that has to be told to not enter the house and kill you? So here's the very best answers that I can give you. So let's answer that first question. Why did God need to go himself through the land? Well, God has already been identified as the direct cause of all the preceding plagues. So it is the same with the death of the wicked. Life doesn't happen by accident, and neither does death. Death is never a random event. Remember, this is a personal, transcendent God. He has a personal investment and interest in every person that has ever lived on this earth. He is not deistic, but relates with us personally, directly, and continually. So, consistent with his nature and the pattern we have already seen in the other plague accounts, yes, God here personally oversaw the destruction of the Egyptian firstborn. God himself needed to personally go through the land and strike them down. So, the next question that I got, did God need to get up close to see the blood on the doors? Like, did he need to go and be like, oh, yep, this house has blood, don't go here? No, he doesn't need to do that. As the matter for him needing to come down and up close to see who has blood on their door frames, he doesn't need to get up close. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. He knows all the things, and he's everywhere all the time. So remember, he is personal. That is the big thing here. We have a personal God. He knows each family. He knows each firstborn. He created each firstborn. He knows each cell. He knows each heart. He knows the hairs on every person's head. So he didn't need to come up close. He knew the heart. He knew who feared and had faith in Yahweh without even coming to the door. The blood on the lintel and doorpost was merely for us. It's that symbolic action for us to go out and put that on our door. I know during Passover, a lot of people put on Facebook and Instagram a red sash around the door of their house. Red fabric, satin fabric, silk fabric. It is that symbolic action of the people in this house fear God and have faith in Yahweh. That was the symbolic action merely for the people. God didn't need them to actually paint that blood on there. That is just for the people. Because God is transcendent and personal. He engages with us. He asks us to do something that comes alongside of him, or we do something and he does something, we come alongside of him in that action. He wants that personal relationship with us. So lastly, we get to that mysterious destroyer. And I hope that you took the time to look up all those verses in your Bible, because it was so surprising to me when I started studying Exodus and I got to that word destroyer. I was like, who is this? What destroyer? Is this the first time I've ever heard that in the Bible? No, it wasn't. Could you believe how many times it's listed over and over in scripture? Destroyer shouldn't be that enigmatic to us because it's listed so much. We need to have an understanding about it. So the last question I got is, who is this destroyer that has been told to enter or not enter your house and kill you? So that mysterious destroyer. So from your homework, who was the destroyer? He is none other than the angel of the Lord. We've seen angel of the Lord a whole bunch in Exodus and a lot in Genesis. It is that angel that causes death. The angel directly represents God. We could say, when it says the angel of the Lord, we could say the angel Yahweh. Yahweh manifesting himself in angel form. When God personally spared those that had faith in him through the blood, he restrained the angel that would otherwise manifest his personal judgment against his enemies. So no blood means no faith, and that means death. How is this plague a foretelling of what Jesus is going to come and do? No blood, no faith is death. I want you to think about how that is just a foreshadowing and a foretaste of what Jesus is going to do. So I hope you understand who the destroyer is. If you don't, text me, email me, put a comment here. We can answer your questions. So the 10th plague now strikes. All the consequences of oppression, resistance, abuse, rebellion, and disbelief come to pass on Egypt in one single night. Suddenly, all at once, struck down by Yahweh himself, the firstborn in every household that does not have the blood on the doorpost dies. If every firstborn in your home died tonight, who would be left? And like I said, in our case, just Brandon. Everybody else, gone. Even my mom and dad, they're both firstborns. Would every Egyptian household indeed experience the 10th plague? Absolutely. Can you imagine the grief that would be going through that entire land? And where do they put all of these bodies? If you listen to a podcast called On the Other Side, put on by Jamie and Aaron Ivey, and I'll link it here, fantastic podcast. Like, if you're going to listen to any of them, listen to that one. It's short stories about people that are on the other side of very difficult things. And there is a man that talks about the Rwandan genocide. And he talks about the mass amount of people that were killed and the bodies that were piled up in the streets, piled up everywhere that you could put some bodies, and the smell, the stench, the overwhelming odor of the death. That is a great podcast to listen to. I think it's about 45 minutes. The man is Rwandan, so it takes probably 5 minutes to really understand his accent because it's very strong. It gives you a great mental picture of what these people were seeing when they walked out of their houses. So turn back with me to page 61 and 25. So get your finger on page 61, then go all the way back to 25. Okay, on page 25, chapter 4, verses 22 through 23 says, because I want to give you a refresher as to why this is happening. I want you to tie in from the beginning of Exodus to now. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my firstborn son. Israel is God's firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. Now flip all the way back to 61, and you're looking at 11:5. And every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and all of the firstborn of the cattle. Pharaoh had done his best to suppress the nation of Israel by killing their firstborn sons. Way back at the beginning, when little Moses was put in his little ark basket into the Nile. Now God sending the exact corresponding disaster, the death of the firstborn. God proves that he can do what Pharaoh ultimately could not do, because Pharaoh sent that edict out for every firstborn son to be killed. Shiphrah and Puah and the other midwives did not follow it. People had children, firstborn children, and went and hid them, the little boys, as they were being born. Pharaoh failed at the purpose of killing these people. Now God is going to show up that he can ultimately do what Pharaoh could not. This is not a case of evil for evil. If this was evil for evil, it would be Israelites finding a way to give Egypt just desserts. But this is divine retribution. Justice to those who deserved it. A judgment against an entire people. God divvied out the punishment. In the crux of his righteousness, perfect judgment against evil. And all I can think about in our day and age is the atrocities of human trafficking, the atrocities of racial inequality and injustice that's happening. And when God decides to have his divine retribution, whether it's in this life or the next, he has it all in hand. When we think we want to do evil for evil to make things just, God has more sovereignty and authority for divine retribution than we could ever consider. So finally, in verse 31, flip back over to page 65. The Israelites are finally allowed to leave. And in what manner did the Israelites leave? Notice they are suddenly going, sudden notice, freely, rapidly, and wealthy. There are 4 things I want you to look at here. The suddenness of the Exodus, and we're going to go over all of these. Why Pharaoh finally gave full and eager permission for the Exodus. Why the Passover observance so strongly emphasizes eating unleavened bread, and how the Israelites financed their 40 years in the wilderness. So let's look at the first one, the suddenness of the Exodus. The pharaohs, not just this pharaoh, that the past pharaohs had such a long-held strategy of keeping control of the Israelites. Now, on a moment's notice, they're free to go. Why do you think there was such a sudden and total reversal? Well, the answer lies at the end of verse 32. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone and bless me also. Pharaoh made a spiritual and psychological shift. The Israelites are now feared, and the Egyptians find themselves in a position of supplication. Like the Egyptians are asking to be blessed by Yahweh and the Israelites, because all of a sudden there is a huge shift. Then the next question is, why did Pharaoh give full and eager permission for the Exodus? Well, the death of the firstborn quickly changed all attitudes. The power of Yahweh could not be ignored any longer. The Egyptian motive was clear. Get these people out before we have any other further consequences unfold. And then the next question, why the Passover observance is so strongly emphasized. Why eating unleavened bread is so important. God knew that there was going to be a rush to get out of Egypt. He says, gird yourself up, get dressed, have your staff in your hand, and be ready to go. Don't leaven this bread, because you're going to be on the move. They needed provisional food for the road. No one could wait for the yeast God knew exactly what they would need. And if you were in our class Wednesday and you got to try that matzah bread, it was fantastic. It's not like they were eating crummy bread, they were eating really good food. How the Israelites financed their 40 years in the wilderness? Well, this is how. God knew how impoverished they had been in Egypt under slavery. The Israelites were not, for the last few dozen of years, living in like lavish conditions. They were living in extreme poverty. They were slaves. How would thousands and hundreds of thousands of people survive in the wilderness for months, which ended up as 40 years? Wouldn't they need to buy supplies from traders, caravanners, local settlements? And even though they didn't know it yet, they were heading towards building the tabernacle. And it was really going to be ornate. So verse 36 says it all. And the Lord, Yahweh, had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Egypt financed it all. Egypt is financing what's going to be the tabernacle in the years to come. What they're taking out of Egypt now, they're taking the gold and the silver, they're plundering them. They are going to build the tabernacle with. Little do they know, but Egypt is going to be funding the tabernacle where God is going to live. The great spoils of war, they got what they asked for because God supernaturally provided. So look at verse 37. This starts the very beginning of the Exodus travel, from the primary departure city to the first stopping point. Check out your page 19 map if you want, and you can start tracing down where they're going to go in the Exodus. So they're leaving now here, Ramses and Succoth, and it says this in verse 37. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses and Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. So that's their starting point. They're journeying from Ramses and Succoth, if you would like to mark that in your page 19 map. So the full Exodus is happening. Nothing and no one is left behind. Verse 38, we just read, a mixed multitude. What does that mean? Well, the Israelites had left Egypt with mixed ethnicity. A mixed multitude could be translated, a huge ethnically diverse group went. Think about it. Egyptians are wanting to leave with them. Other races have watched that what Yahweh did, believed, and wanted to join. Yahweh and leaving Egypt represents their best hope for the future. So think about this. These people, these Egyptians, have watched what has been going on in their country. Their country lies in ruins, from the locusts to the death of the livestock, to the hail, to the darkness. Their country lies in ruins. They are seeing their best hope for the future, their best chance for something better is to leave with the Israelites and pledge their loyalty to Yahweh. So what is the significance of verse 40 and 41 being added here in the scripture? Look at page 66, and I'm going to read verse 40 and 41. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt. So, it is a reminder of how long the people were in Egypt, yes. Many generations, some people say up to 14 to 15 generations of people that lived there. Plenty of time for that 70 that originally entered to now be tens of thousands. So look at verses 43 through 51. This is the summation of chapters 11 and 12, all neat and tidy. Remember verse 40 through 42 said that when the Passover was observed. These next verses clarify who may eat the Passover meal. It tells us where and how it must be eaten, and it reminds us again of the when. So think of the Passover in this way. It commemorates a crucial event in Israelite history. Therefore, its observance must also be an event. And we know from Pastor David that we just did like a mini one of what would really be a very long event of Passover. It has a process. It has a who, a where, a when, and how. Because our God is always ordered, and he expects us to be too. Look at verse 43. This is when God addresses both Moses and Aaron. Did you notice that he addresses them both? It says, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it. But he's addressing both of them. Why? Think back to their genealogy, which we studied a couple of weeks ago, and look back at it if you want to. Moses and Aaron are full-blooded Levites. As we will learn, this is going to be the priestly tribe. Moving into Exodus part 2, this is going to be the priestly tribe. It's appropriate that God addresses these men about the Passover because it's going to become a religious rite. That means the priestly tribe will be looking over and supervising this religious rite. So all subsequent priests and Levites would be heirs of keeping this important statute. That's why it's important for both of them to hear this. So let's clear up no foreigner may eat of it. We already know this is a mixed multitude. This is Israelites, this is Egyptians, possibly some Midianites, some other people that had gone to Egypt that are now leaving with the Israelites. These verses are calling for a specific mandate. According to these verses, I want you to connect Genesis with an Abraham story with this right now. What qualifies you as someone who can partake of Passover? What act, what rite, ritual, tradition do you have in the Old Testament that makes you not be a foreigner anymore, but makes you an Israelite? Look at verse 44. But every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. It's circumcision. We're seeing it again. Remember when God sought to kill Moses? It was because Gershom, his son, wasn't circumcised. He wasn't part of this family of God. He needed to be in the family of God to take this Passover. Can you remember also circumcision, not only family of God, but all of Abraham's descendants, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and so on, had to be circumcised because of the covenant community, the covenant promises. Those went from each generation because of circumcision. That tradition of circumcising, that covenant promise, it's not racial, it's not ethnic, it's just the obedience of circumcision. So thank goodness that Passover is not restricted by social status. It's simple. All who have faith in Yahweh are included. Males to be circumcised and females by their relationship. So I want you to consider this. At this point, the Israelites were unaware that there's going to be a 39-year hiatus between this Passover that's about to be celebrated and the next one celebrated in the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership. Many of the Israelites exiting Egypt would have this one Passover and then never again, because some of them, their lives ended in the wilderness. Some would only have the first Passover in Egypt before the Exodus. Like, this is such an important thing because this Passover might be the only Passover that they have. And then they might not ever get to do it in remembrance again throughout the years. Look at verses 50 and 51. Remember those fulfillment signs, the fulfillment notices. Look back at Genesis 6:22 with Noah. Noah did this. He did all that he commanded them. Exodus 7:6 says, Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Lord commanded him. And then here are more fulfillment notices here in verse 50 and 51. All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, Yahweh brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. I want you to remember they're waiting for the fulfillment sign. At the burning bush, God had said, when you get back here and worship, this will be a sign that I have brought you out and that everything that I say I'm going to do has been done. So they're now leaving Egypt in the Exodus, going towards that fulfillment sign. But in the meantime, we have this small fulfillment notice. Everything, they did this just as God commanded them. All the people of Israel did it just as Yahweh commanded Moses and Aaron. Without these fulfillment notices, all of the prediction fulfillment and command fulfillment stories in the Bible, people would wonder if what was predicted actually happened. These little things are put in there, these little notices that everything that God said that was going to happen had happened just like he said it. So now it's the morning after the Passover. And the Israelites have grouped together as an army, and they're starting their Israelite Exodus journey. This is Exodus day 1. Man, I feel like for them, what an exciting thing that's going to happen. So next week, when you start studying Exodus 13 and 14, you're going to see consecration. We're going to talk about that. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So we're going to talk about more Passover stuff. God is going to show up in a pillar of cloud and fire, and then we're going to get to the Red Sea. So just when they think, oh, we're finally out the door, we've plundered the Egyptians, it is not over for them yet. Moses and Pharaoh are going to have another showdown. So I hope you have a fantastic week. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time reviewing that. Please, and go back and watch the Passover class if you were not there in person, because it's really something that you don't want to miss. I love you guys. Think about you all the time. Can't wait to see you next week. And hoping you're having a lovely weekend. Bye.